And I've talked about a total of almost 400,000 casualties, people that are wounded. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, more than half of those will never return to duty because the wounds are too horrific. In other words, they're permanently lost to the Ukrainian fight. Now, supposedly when Zaluzhny was in town speaking to Secretary Austin and General Milley, several people have insisted that he actually told them that 257,000 Ukrainians have died. That includes soldiers, in other words, those in uniform, civilians, all types, all kinds, 257,000. Well, we don't know. I mean, that's an unconfirmed rumor. But what it does tell you is that today in Ukraine, there are roughly between 18 and 22 million people left in the country under Zelensky's control. Now, Judge, that number is roughly the same as the number of people living in the Netherlands. You cannot sustain this war with that small population. Judge, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
For watching and listening. Sometimes I'm all thumbs. I want to play a clip from Jack Devine. This is a guy that our audience loves to hate. He is, however, career CIA, and for many years was in charge of American espionage in Russia and monitoring Russian espionage here. Here's Jack Devine betting on a Ukraine win.
I'm betting on the Ukrainians still. It's not to say that the Russians aren't going to be formidable. I do think there will be undertrained. There'll be sometimes when you create something big and it's not well trained, they become cannon fodder. So I think it's going to be a really tough spring, and I think the war in many ways will be decided. There won't be a victor. In other words, the Russians cannot conquer Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to beat the Russians. There's a certain point where both sides pull back. Even if you don't have an agreement, they lower their intensity. And that's what I think Putin personally is in trouble in his own country, and I think he goes. That's why the stakes are so big.
So he's suggesting that this will be over when both sides lower their intensity, and if Putin does that, quote, he goes, because that will not be interpreted as a victory for the Russian nationalists. Your comments on that, Colonel?
Well, remember, the CIA has been telling us lies almost from the very beginning about everything happening in Russia.
Well, when Mike Pompeo was running the CIA, he publicly acknowledged that's their job, to lie to us. So how do you know whether to believe them or not?
Well, they do a very good job of lying. The problem is they're lying to Americans, and this man, Devine, knows absolutely nothing about Russians. I don't care what his job was, or about Ukrainians or the Slavic peoples that occupy Eastern Europe. The Russians are winning. Ukraine is crumbling. Ukraine's on the verge of collapse. We're going to watch that happen over the next several weeks. The Russians will crush out of existence what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think they'll have to go after this regime, assuming Zelensky and his friends don't rapidly flee the country to Poland or somewhere else. Now, having said that, the Russians are being very methodical, very deliberate. They are moving constantly, but they are not moving on multiple axes simultaneously. In other words, you're not going to see the blitzkrieg. What you're going to see on several axes are what I would call large meat grinders that are just systematically plowing forward, annihilating everything that they come in touch with that is Ukrainian until the Ukrainians are finished. There is no incentive for them at this point to negotiate with us unless we go in without conditions. Would the Russians prefer not to annihilate everything in Ukraine? Yes. They never went in there with that goal to begin with. But you can't walk in there and say, well, the only way we'll talk to you is if you withdraw all your forces from Ukraine and Crimea. That's absurd.
So really what you're saying is there's no way that Ukraine, and I'm paraphrasing you from the column, which I mentioned earlier, there's no way Ukraine can survive this war as an intact country.
Listen, I just told you what the demographics say. And what's even worse is that Ukraine has the lowest birth rate in Europe.
Oh.
So in addition to having lost millions of people because frankly, people like Devine and his masters have decided to wage this war on the backs of Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed. I don't know what survives of it. I have no idea what will happen.
Even though I am your friend and admirer, and at times your student, let me raise your blood pressure one more time with Jack Devine on a weakened Russia.
Do we want a strong Russia with Putin and Xi? Is that going to bring us peace and harmony so we can live in isolation? I think Putin, the day he crossed, I'm on record in the Washington Post, in March last year, a few days after he invaded, he sowed the seed of his own demise. That is actually good news for us. Whoever causes it, that's a good news. A weak Russia that sees Putin going weakens China as well as Russia.
Does that make sense to you?
Again, I think the man's delusional. Putin has never been stronger than he is today. The Russian people have never been more united than they are today. Only someone who's never spent any time in the country and doesn't know anybody over there would make such preposterous statements. This is part of the larger false narrative. Look, he reminds me of some of the Germans that stood around in Berlin in 1945 and asked, what about the inevitable victory? What's wrong? What's happened? Because the regime over the previous 6 to 12 months had lied so consistently and effectively that the Germans were surprised to see Russian and American troops on the outskirts of the city. I think all I can tell you is that no, he's dead wrong. Now let's talk about this weakened Russia business. It's not weakened. The IMF has now stepped forward and talked about growth in Russia dramatically improving. Their exports are way up. None of this nonsense that we anticipated that was bad has happened to Russia. Russia's in a very strong and healthy position. We, on the other hand, our growth is declining, and it's not going to get better in the near term. Secondly, Russia is a state with an important role in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. If Russia were to be destroyed, which is not going to happen, if it were to weaken, it would open up opportunities for all sorts of potentially malicious actors to intervene. First of all, Eastern Siberia is not of much interest to the Chinese, contrary to popular belief, but it's very interesting to Japan and Korea. And the Japanese and the Koreans view Eastern Siberia as their territory because up until about 300 years ago, Mongols, Turkic peoples, Tartars, they were the only people in the region, and they're brothers of the Manchus, Mongols, and Japanese and Koreans. So do you really want Russia to collapse in Eastern Siberia? I don't think so. You go into Central Asia, Russia is a stabilizing factor there. In fact, Xi depends upon Russia to help stabilize it because the people in Central Asia have much more confidence and trust in the Russians than they do in the Chinese.
How unified is NATO behind Washington? I'm going to play a clip. Yeah, right. I'm going to play a clip for you in a minute from the president of Croatia. It's not Germany. It's not France. It's Croatia. But the language is very strident, and the criticisms of the West are very strong and articulate. Take a listen.
Ja nisam predsjednik Ukrajine.
Ako se Ukrajina želi braniti, treba li joj pomoći?
Razdragani pacifisti u cvjetnim haljenicama odjednom bi se napili krvi nekome, ali ne oni, nego preko tuđe grbače. Ovo je u određenoj mjeri duboko nemoralno što radimo kao kolektivni zapad koji u biti ne postoji, jer tu nema rješenja. Rješenje nije promjena vlasti u Rusiji. Dapače, njemački tenkovi u Harkovu će dodatno homogenizirati Ruse. Politički će ih homogenizirati. Zbližit će ih sa Kinezima. To se događa.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. The West is not united. You've been saying that. The tanks coming from Germany, he didn't mention the American tanks. The tanks coming from Germany will only gin up the Russians to fight more aggressively. It's in nobody's interest to weaken Russia. And he's a member of NATO.
Of course. Two things. Nassim Taleb often talks about finance, and he talks about people at the top who don't have skin in the game. Our problem in Washington, D.C., and in many capitals in Europe right now is that they're perfectly happy to fight this war until Ukraine ceases to exist, and 1 million Ukrainians are dead because they have no skin in the game. They haven't put themselves at risk, nor will they do so. And that's disgraceful, and he's talking about that to some extent. And then secondly, it's interesting this man is a Croat because, the Croatians, like most Europeans, to be perfectly blunt, that people don't like to admit, were part of the crusade to destroy Bolshevism during World War II. But he knows that Russia is not a communist state. He knows Russia does not aspire to conquer Europe. The Russians learned the hard way that imperialism is a very bad form of government and business. When you move into countries that are not yours and you have to govern and sustain people that are not yours, inevitably there's bad blood, there's anger, there's corruption. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who probably more than anyone else inspires the Russians who are at the top today, made it very clear we should all be grateful that this horrible empire that existed is gone. We don't want to govern other people. We want to govern ourselves. We want our own country, this place called Russia. And that is the way the Russians think right now. They're not interested in conquering anything, but we are making it impossible for them to turn away because we make threat after threat after threat to dismember the country, to destroy its regime. And we keep talking about it as though this is something the Russians want. They do not want that.
After decades of German political leaders disarming Germany and depriving Berlin of its credibility, I'm quoting your article, Chancellor Scholz decides to send tanks. Is this to please Joe Biden? Because he's not going to please anybody his domestic political forces, is he?
He'll please some people in Germany, a minority, I would suspect. The majority, I think, are somewhat horrified because the Germans, based on their experience, and they also know their own history, know that when Berlin and Moscow have cooperated and done business together, there has been peace in Europe. You know, if there's any one war in human history that made absolutely no sense, it was the war between Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. They had been close allies and friends for hundreds of years. There was no reason for that to happen. It did. The Second World War, we know the background on that. It was a huge tragedy. Everyone decided in 1945, who was German, this will not happen again. We will not permit it. I cannot imagine Chancellor Kohl or Chancellor Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, that some of your viewers may remember, standing up and urging equipment be sent to this corrupt gangster regime in Kiev that's killing off its own people with these stupid instructions that are given to their generals in the field with a military structure that is corrupt and celebrating it. On the contrary, I think they would have said absolutely not, out of the question. This man, Scholz, is not going to last long. And if anything, what we're seeing now, even though it is not patently obvious, is the beginning of the end of NATO.
So, Colonel, big picture, here's my head scratcher. If the West, if the leading countries economically in NATO, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France, want to wage this war against Russia, if Tony Blinken and his globalist buddies in the foreign ministries in Western Europe really think that they can use the war to push Putin out or weaken him, if Jack Devine and the CIA, or if Jack is actually articulating what the CIA is trying to accomplish, why is the Western military response so tepid? I mean, you can't fight the Russians with just a half dozen tanks. And you can't fight them at all with tanks that aren't going to get there for another 4 or 5 or 6 months. And American troops in Poland are not going to keep Putin up at night.
We have 100,000 troops in Europe. And of that number, I'd be surprised if we have 40 or 50,000 combat troops. That means the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains who actually go in and shoot people. In other words, most of that is still support. And we don't have that much artillery. We don't have that much in the way of immediate indirect fire support. We're in no position to do it. We could bring in more Poles. They can bring in a couple of 100,000 Poles to fight, but they're not going to be adequately armed to take on the Russians, and they're not going to be adequately trained. So it's sheer lunacy. But again, you've got to go back and understand how this began. At the beginning, Putin sent in a very small force and gave them very specific instructions that they were not to kill civilians, they were not to damage infrastructure, because he was simply trying to demonstrate the seriousness with which Russia viewed what we were doing in eastern Ukraine by building up this dangerous force against them. Well, it took 2-3 months. He finally figured out no one is going to negotiate with us. No one cares to. In the meantime, we reached the erroneous conclusion that, see, look, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't cope. The Russians are no threat. We can beat them. Well, that was the wrong conclusion. And what we're seeing happen right now is a massive expansion of Russian military power on a scale that we have not seen since the Cold War. And this is going to be a permanent expansion, a large and powerful force. The 700,000 plus that are around Ukraine right now are a brand new force, a brand new army. This thing is poised to do one thing: annihilate whatever is in its path. It will do that. However, again, the Russians are being methodical. They're being cautious because they do worry that we are led by impulsive, erratic personalities in Washington. And that stupidly, when we realize that the place is falling apart, I mean Ukraine, someone will say, well, we have to do something. I don't know how many times while I was on active duty, I heard people at the top of the political structure say, well, we have to do something. As soon as they say that,
right,
leave the room.
Right.
Get the hell out of there.
I mean, this is a favorite government line. They have to give the impression to the public that they're doing something, even if it's 180 degrees from what they're doing. But the West, whether it's Chancellor Scholz or President Biden, or to a lesser extent, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like a boxer punching with his left hand and then apologizing to the gallery with his right for hitting too hard. What are they accomplishing?
Scholz is doing what he's done throughout his career. Remember that Scholz and others have grown up over the last 30 or 40 years in this environment where there was very little change. And their formative period of experience came after the Cold War ended. And they saw a very different world. And they became, I think, enamored of this notion that the United States is the hegemon of the world, and that whatever we do is right, and anybody who resists us is morally wrong. They've taken this position, and this justifies all sorts of dangerous behavior. I don't think that Mr. Scholz is going to last much longer. I certainly don't think his foreign minister will. These people are out of touch with reality. No competent German statesman over the last 300 or 400 years would have made the stupid remarks and statements that they have.
Didn't he just lose his defense minister about 2 weeks ago?
Well, we haven't had much of it in the way of defense ministers in that country now for at least 20 years.
A moment or so to look at it. The red starbursts represent areas where there's been the concentration of Russian missiles and artillery. The blue represent areas of blackouts where there's no electricity or water to speak of. In the sort of lower right of this portion of Ukraine, the striped area represents the area that has been under Russia's control for a while. So let me start going all the way west. Are you surprised that the Russians sent their missiles all the way west? Well, what is the next country over there west? Forgive my ignorance.
Well, west from the map that you're looking at right now, where you see Lvov, just west of that 20 miles is the Polish border.
Wow. Is it reckless for the Russians to send their missiles so close to the Polish border? Is that a lesson to NATO?
No, it's not reckless at all. First of all, to understand what's happening now, this is very similar to what the United States did in Iraq, to what it did to the Serbs during the Balkan campaigns, the Kosovo Air campaign, very similar to what we did during World War II to Germany and Japan. We systematically identified the networks, the infrastructure for fuel storage, fuel distribution, and today power plants on a grand scale. We did that. We destroyed those places and essentially put countries in the dark and did exactly what you're describing. Made it impossible for them to effectively lead normal lives. That was part of the plan. It worked very effectively in Germany. I mean, we were so effective against the fuel refining, storage, and distribution that it brought the Air Force and the Army almost to a standstill in Germany in 1945, certainly by the end of 44. So that's what we're doing now. And this is long overdue. And this is part of the larger plan to prepare Ukraine for the coming offensives. I mean, why would you let your opponent lead a comfortable, leisurely existence if you plan to attack him on a grand scale on the ground?
Right.
And see, before when this first phase, no one ever completely grasped what Moscow wanted. They wanted an arrangement. They wanted a negotiated settlement. They were not interested in destroying the country. They didn't want to kill large numbers of people. By the middle of the summer, it was clear that's not going to work. So they threw those assumptions out. They went on to essentially a strategic defense, an economy of force mission. Let's use as few forces as possible to hold on to what's ours, and then we'll build up for the offensive. And that's what's been going on. Now it's getting cold finally. So perhaps in 3, 4, 5 weeks or something, we'll see a major offensive.
Gary, can you put the map up again? Colonel, I want to ask you about the sort of lower right-hand portion, if you will,
right,
where you see the gray and black stripes. Now, as I understand the symbols on the map, that reflects the portions of Ukraine which are in which Russian-speaking people live and which the
yes.
Russian government controls.
Yes.
If I'm correct, don't I also see some red symbols there showing Putin attacking that area with either missiles or artillery? How unusual is that? There are Russians living there.
Well, let's not say Putin attacking. You know, he's in Moscow, and
Okay.
these strikes are ordered by the high command of the Russian theater and General Surovikin.
Okay,
Strike
so the generals in chief are attacking where Russians live. Am I right?
Well, first of all, understand something. Today we have this capability we call strike. Strike is different from what we imagine the standard use for artillery or rockets or missiles might be in the West. The only thing that separates one strike from another is time and space. And we have precision, which means that we could literally, if we saw something in your backyard where you live, Judge, and we thought it was threatening to us, we could target it and destroy everything in your backyard without necessarily harming you. Now, we demonstrated that capability during the Kosovo air campaign. Some of your viewers will remember that the Albanians in particular were shocked at our ability to attack Serb forces that stood next to or were positioned very close to Albanian homes, but they never damaged any Albanian homes. Well, the Russians can do the same thing. And so there was a decision to attack there, ostensibly because there was some connectivity to this power generation network, and they decided to remove it. Now, beyond that, I don't know the details, but it's eminently capable. They're eminently capable of doing this with great precision. That's why striking those targets that were near the border with Poland was not reckless, because they know they can hit them with absolute precision.
Okay, Gary, put the map up again, please. So, Colonel, if the Russians can move with that much precision, then their strikes around Lviv and Kyiv, which we know destroyed residential areas, were done intentionally, that the destruction of homes and apartment buildings was not a byproduct, it was the goal. Is that fair to say?
No, again, that's not accurate, because the power stations and the power distribution networks were inside those areas. In other words, they didn't decide we just want to level Kyiv. I mean, if they wanted to level Kyiv, they could do it tomorrow morning. It would take a couple of hours. So
where on the map is the nuclear power plant or nuclear power plants?
Well, the nuclear power plant of greatest interest, of course, is the one to the south in the vicinity of Zaporozhye, which the Russians are protecting. The Ukrainians have repeatedly tried to launch missiles and rockets and artillery rounds against that power station in the hopes of precipitating a nuclear crisis that they think they would benefit from.
All right, right above Zaporozhye, it shows the symbol for an explosion. Then to the left of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for a blackout, and to the right of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for the blackout. So you're telling us that they want to isolate without destroying and prevent the use of the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye.
Yeah, well, it's not a question so much of preventing Ukrainians from using it. They are protecting that plant from Ukrainian attacks. Now, what they have done is that they have removed the connectivity, as you point out, involving the transmission of power from these plants to Ukraine. That has been done, and that will continue to be done. And we ought to pause for a minute and understand the cascading effects of these attacks. This affects everything, every part of life in Ukraine. you're not just talking about transportation and water, of course. You're also talking about rural life where you have herds of cattle, herds of sheep, vast farmlands. Now those animals and the farmland is lying fallow. The animals are dying. They're losing 20, 30% of their livestock, not because the Russians are killing them, but because they can't feed them. They can't move them. They can't sell them. They can't care for them. So the cascading effects are destroying completely the Ukrainian economy. So Ukraine's output is about non-existent now.
So December 1st is 3 days from now. There's already snow on the ground in the northern parts of Ukraine. Where do you see this going in the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, say between now and the first of the year?
Well, the experts on these matters, and I'm not one of them, that know something about the weather and about the terrain in Ukraine. I've seen some of Ukraine, but not all of it. And the Ukrainian black earth topsoil varies from 4 to 12 to 15 feet deep. It depends on where you are. That's why it's such a productive region. You have to freeze that, because if it's not thoroughly frozen, you sink like a rock, whether you're in a truck or you're in a tank. It doesn't make any difference. It's not frozen yet. It's only just now dropped below freezing on a permanent basis. Up till this point, we've had freezing at night, but during the daytime, it's gone back up into the 40s or even 50 degrees. It has to drop below freezing and stay that way for at least 2 weeks. So if it's now below freezing and it stays that way, you can do the math. You're looking for something happening no earlier than the 10th, probably no later than the 19th of December. And you're talking about concentrations of Russian troops all the way around the country. We've accounted now formally by these are the people that sit in front of your monitors that control satellites. And the intelligence community says that it's accounted for 540,000 Russian troops. Okay. And of that 540,000, we're talking about 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, of which at least 1,500 are tanks. Probably another 1,000 self-propelled artillery, the rest infantry fighting vehicles. 1,000 rockets, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, your so-called drones, unmanned attack systems, 1,000 of those systems. That doesn't even begin to address the hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, hundreds of helicopters. The helicopters will move troops, obviously. There will be some ground support, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft operating as close air support, and also bombers now. We've begun to see the use of bombers, which is something we've done for years. They're now beginning to do it, and they all have precision munitions.
Okay, so
which you aim at.
What you've just described must be understood and known by President Zelensky, by Ukrainian intelligence, by American intelligence, by the State Department, by the Pentagon, and by the White House.
Yes.
And what are they going to do about it?
Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ship more equipment to the Ukrainians. The problem is the Ukrainian casualties have been horrendous, particularly over the last few months. There was an article today in the Euro News. I'm told there's another one in the New York Times describing the very, very heavy casualties. Of course, the big lie that is always told to accompany the bad news is, well, the Russians have taken heavy casualties too. Nonsense. The Russians have not. And that's the difference. When you're killing your enemy at a 10-to-1 ratio, which is about where it is right now in southern Ukraine with the Russians and Ukrainians, you're not hurting at all. And the Russians, again, aren't running out of anything. The Ukrainians are running out of everything. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, you name it. Their soldiers, most of the best troops are dead or wounded. And the people that they're shoving forward in the defensive positions are untrained reservists. They say, well, we sent 10,000 more troops to England for 3 weeks. Judge, you're not going to be able to train a man in 3 weeks to do much of anything, or even 5 weeks. You need time. And time is something the Ukrainians no longer have. So the whole thing is on the verge of collapse.
Let's pretend you are back in the Pentagon as you were for a portion of the Trump administration. And Secretary Austin along with Secretary Blinken, knock on your door. Colonel, what's your advice? What would you tell them? Get the hell out?
I would show them the map and show them the identified concentrations of Russian forces, along with a list of the capabilities, which are impressive in terms of firepower and maneuver. And I would also then bring up a truthful picture of Ukrainian fighting capabilities right now, which are very, very modest. And I would argue, given the terrible conditions that the population faces in Ukraine, it's no surprise that the Ukrainian government is saying leave. Even Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kyiv, has told the population, you really should leave. We're not going to have any power. We won't have water and fuel to heat. You're going to have to go somewhere else and seek shelter. This is the capital city. And millions of these Ukrainians are going to pack it in and they're going to head west. So you're going to have another gigantic mass casualty event, if you will, on Europe's doorstep, with millions of refugees pouring into Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. And obviously, in many cases, these frontline states will simply herd them further west into other countries. And
these Russian oligarchs' yachts that were seized, that was just for show. Yeah. Is there a time when Tony Blinken and company realized we're on the wrong track and we got to get out of this?
I think privately they recognize that they are very much on the wrong track. I think they are taking alarmist phone calls from everywhere, from Stockholm to Berlin to Rome, Paris, Madrid. So I think they know that. The problem is they have no plan B. There was never any serious thought given to this whole process. In other words, what was the objective to begin with? No one had a stated objective except to build up the Ukrainian military to not only present a threat to Russia, but to potentially recapture Crimea and harm the Russian military. Well, this is fanciful nonsense that never made any sense. So there is no plan B. So I think they're going to do what you would expect these ideologues to do, which is double down on what they're already doing and then hope against hope that they can outlast this. And I'm not sure that they can. I mean, my recommendation, frankly, is send Nancy Pelosi to Kiev and let her sort it out and just leave her there until it's fixed.
She's threatening to go to all places, to Taiwan. And of course, Beijing is not very happy about that. And they're threatening some severe response to that. We'll talk about Nancy later. Tell me about the actual war. I mean, you don't see it on television anymore. You don't even see it on the front pages of the New York Times. So a couple of questions. Are the Ukrainians holding any ground? Have they won back any ground from the Russians?
No.
Have they actually used American military hardware to attack Russian hardware that is already inside Ukraine? So they're part of Ukraine is bombing another part of Ukraine. And where does Zelensky stand in his stability as the head of the Ukrainian government?
Well, as you know, Zelensky now fired Bakhanov and several other people that were in charge of the security services.
Very senior people.
Yeah, it looks like, the last days of Pompeii. The volcano has erupted, and now he's looking for people to blame for the lava flows that are pouring through the streets. So I think that's part of the problem. I don't think Zelensky is really in charge of a great deal anymore. He's got a force out there. The nationalists are trying to control what's left of it. They're rounding up deserters and either shooting them or forcing them back into action. But the truth is the Ukrainian forces are defeated. They can't regain what's lost. Most of the Russian army has been withdrawn, Judge. I'm talking about the combat force. They have been resting and refitting for the last few weeks. And the fighting in Donbass, which was always the critical portion of this operation, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were located, has been done by Chechen forces, separatist forces that have taken heavy casualties, and mercenaries. Those are the ones backed by massive Russian artillery, regular army artillery, but the regular army combat force that we saw at the beginning, that's been resting and refitting. And I think they're preparing for a massive offensive to finish off this war once and for all. And again, Putin is not interested in crossing the Dnieper River and going into Western Ukraine. But I think he will roll up to the Dnieper to a certain point, and then I think he still wants to gain control of Kharkov and Odessa.
All right. But as you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, Putin cannot tolerate a free and independent Ukraine, much less a Ukraine that's a member of NATO, because that's a permanent 24/7 threat to Moscow. Am I right?
Well,
have I grasped properly what you wrote in this piece?
Well, not completely. I mean, it can be free and independent as far as he's concerned. It cannot be a puppet of the West. It can't be a platform for attack against him.
Or if it's a member of NATO, he views it as a puppet for the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, privately, he's told many people he doesn't care if Ukraine's part of the European Union, could care less. His concern from the very beginning was this massive NATO trained and equipped army funded largely by us. That's no longer in the picture. But what I'm concerned about, what many Europeans privately are concerned about, I know Berlin is very much so. And remember, Berlin is still the elephant in the room economically. And right next to Berlin is a somewhat smaller elephant called Italy. Both of these states are concerned that what will happen is that we will go back into Ukraine in a subversive way and try to continue to use the Ukrainian people and the rump Ukrainian state as an opportunity to attack and threaten Russia. That's what he doesn't want. And that's what Berlin and Rome don't want. No European wants that. That means literally in our lifetimes, perpetual war, to the point where finally Putin decides, I don't want to go there. I don't want a border with NATO. Remember, that's one of the things he doesn't want. He doesn't want a border with NATO. He's already got a small one way up north in Estonia. He doesn't want it. So if he can't live with the situation because we make it impossible, well, then, you're forcing his hand again. I think it's time for this to end, and I think the Russians are going to try to do that over the next 30 days.
What are U.S. intelligence, senior members of the intelligence community advising the president? If you know, are they telling him what they think he wants to hear? Or are they telling him what you've just described, that this is a lost cause, it's over with, you better get the hell out and get out now?
Judge, the thing for all of your viewers to keep in mind is that presidents always get the intelligence they want.
Even if it's not truthful.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because we've lost our sense of proportionality. If you think that you are invulnerable, invincible, and more powerful than everyone else, then you think you can afford to ignore things like the truth when it suits you. This has gotten us into a lot of trouble now, I think, with Russia, because Russia is not Iraq. Russia is not Afghanistan. It's not Libya. And we're talking now, I listened to the former Secretary of State Pompeo essentially describe the apocalypse, the unification of Russia, China, and Tehran into one iron alliance that we should then set out to crush. I mean, this is the sort of madness that is rampant in Washington, and it presupposes that we are more than we are. In other words, we are not the nation, Judge, as you know, that we were in 1991. Right. 30 years ago, we were a very different country than the country today. And there doesn't seem to be any willingness to admit that and figure out that we've got serious problems here that need our attention. By the way, that's true for Western Europe.
One of the problems that you point out in your piece, Worshipping Dead Horses, you sort of pivot from explaining the uselessness and weakness of NATO into serious problems with the American military, which have been visited upon it by the attitude of current leadership, the Biden administration, with respect to promoting people on the basis of race and gender who are not the most qualified, and establishing the sort of woke atmosphere in the military that people like you and I and people watching us today laugh at when we see happening on college campuses. Now you're telling me and telling your readers that this is happening in the U.S. military. Have they considered the long-term effect of this nonsense?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think they have, and I don't think they understand just how debilitating it is. On the one hand, you have a president who is more warlike, frankly, more aggressive, more bellicose than any president I can remember in my lifetime when he talks about Russia. Not China, but Russia.
Right.
It's unbelievable.
George W. was bellicose, but not with respect to Russia.
Never. Absolutely not. And the key thing here is that while we have all this bellicosity on one side, we're systematically devastating the armed forces on the other side.
Tell us how the armed forces are being systematically devastated.
Well,
the
imagine
American armed forces.
Imagine you have a group of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, doesn't matter, but I would think certainly soldiers and Marines, and you announce that the commander has been removed and you have a new commander. Your new commander is Tiny Tim, with the ukulele in the flowered shirt and the long hair.
Right, this is crazy.
He has kind of a uniform on, but
this is crazy, Colonel.
Yeah, but that's essentially what you've got, and says, look, Tiny Tim is one of the finest people we've ever met, and by the way, he's transgender, but you've got to take showers with him because he deserves the opportunity to take showers with you, even though he's transgender. And he may not wear a skirt all the time, but he's wearing one today. You have to tolerate all of this. This is important, and this is what makes us free. This is what we're talking about with diversity. And then the other thing is, I'm sorry, you're not a woman, you're not black, you're something else. You may be white, you may be Asian, Northeast Asian. We're not interested in you. We don't care how well you have performed. We don't care how many years you've served. We don't care about your performance under fire in combat. We're interested in Sheila over here and moving her forward because we want a new force that is radically different from the one you're in.
All right. When the government, and I realize there's some metaphors and exaggerations in there, but it's largely a summary of what's been happening. When the government does that, does it think in the long term, we don't use a draft anymore. We really need volunteers. We need thousands of volunteers every year. And our base for volunteers are young, virile men who really don't care about woke and don't want wokeness imposed on them, whether the young men are white or black or Hispanic or brown or whatever they may be. My point is, does the Biden administration leadership in the Pentagon recognize that imposing wokeness on the military will have a catastrophic effect on recruiting in the long term?
I think they've already seen it. We're already confronting this catastrophic impact on recruiting. We can't recruit the people that we want. And their attitude is, it doesn't make any difference. We'll just drop the standards. We'll start recruiting people that we normally never take into the armed forces, people that are far below the desired IQ levels, people that have criminal records, people that may have serious problems, drug problems or something else. This is already happening. So again, I think they view it as none of these things matter anymore. We live in the era of push-button warfare. Fire a missile. We're still the biggest, most powerful, richest country in the world. We can do pretty much as we want. And the important thing in the backs of their minds is that we're building a force that reflects our leftist ideology and values. And we're replacing the values that were historically motivating inside the armed forces with our new values.
One of my viewers just texted us, who wants to die for Biden and Zelensky. It's just so appealing. I mean, no American wants to do that. Does Tony Blinken, does Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, do they think American troops want to die either for wokeness or for Zelensky?
Lloyd Austin is a mystery to me. I've never met the man. And looking back on the years that he served, he certainly was an enormously, let's put it this way, he benefited enormously from the system that we have in place, right. Affirmative action and other things. And yet he's turned on the institution and seems to be turning on the American people and the country with incredible hatred and distaste. It's hard for me to fathom and imagine. It's even more difficult for me to look at senior officers who stand around and act as though this is perfectly normal. And when you say, what the hell are you doing? Their answer is, well, I've got orders. Wow. Orders to do what? Destroy the force?
Right.
ruin
right.
morale, destroy cohesion, destroy discipline. We don't even have the authority today in the chain of command that we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago to take action when it's required.
What is the level of wokeness? It's hard for me to ask this with a straight face in the Russian army.
Yeah, that's a great question. The last time I looked at a recruiting video, I'd say about 0. Everybody there understands the Russian army exists to kill enemies of the Russian state. And all the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines understand that's their number one task. We go to where we're ordered and we defend the country and we kill the enemies of the state.
All right. We're now at the end of July. Where will we be by Labor Day in the war in Ukraine?
I'd be
still
very
sending billions of dollars in cash and material there, or
Well, I'm glad you
recognizing
brought that
the
up.
folly of what we've done.
I'm glad you brought that up because most Americans don't understand, Judge. If you look at this 40 billion package that we passed back in May, almost universally,
Right.
only about half of that is for military assistance. It's still 20 billion, but it's enormous.
What's the other half?
Well, the other half is it's unclear. It goes into aid and assistance that we would term nation building, support the Ukrainian state, humanitarian assistance, medical support, and so forth for the war. But most of the money for military equipment and military assistance really doesn't leave the United States. And this is what most people don't understand. When we say we're going to give the Ukrainians, for discussion purposes, let's just say 100 artillery pieces, we turn to the Department of Defense and say, send 100 artillery pieces to Ukraine. And they say, yes, sir. Then we send money over to the Pentagon to pay for the 100 artillery systems that we've taken and shipped. They then take that amount of money, whatever it is, for those artillery systems, and they turn and give it to the defense industries and say, give us replacements.
Right.
So it's kind of a circular system, because at the same time, remember, when all this money moves from Capitol Hill to DOD to the military industrial complex that we know as the defense industries, that money also involves donations for people on the Hill. That money involves making constituents happy, providing them with employment and jobs and so forth.
Which might explain why the Congress voted actually to give more money than Uncle Joe asked them for, because they're all looking for their next contribution. The late, great Justice Scalia used to say, it doesn't matter why members of Congress say they voted for anything. They only vote for anything for one reason, and one reason only: to get reelected.
Yeah, and that involves a lot of money.
The equipment that's on its way there, or that's there, this is not brand new, just built in North Carolina stuff, is it? Is this stuff that's been surplus, sitting in Warsaw or in a warehouse somewhere outside of Warsaw?
It's a mix. You know, some old things have been sent, but a lot of this is relatively new